Hey y'all, hope you're doing good today. So, in today's message, we're going to be looking at the story by Shakespeare called Much Ado About Nothing. And this was a fun story to read. It was just some very interesting characters that are very relatable, especially if you're thinking about just life itself and people that you know and different seasons in your life and all the challenges that it throws around with regards to meeting people and having feelings and trying to determine if you want to date somebody and things like that. So it was just fun to read. I enjoyed it, and I hope you enjoyed it as well. So I'm not going to read word for word, but I will be sharing a good bit from the book. So, and I want to say this too. Why are we studying these stories like we are on a channel that is intended for growth and healing? And the reason I would say that is this. There are plenty of channels out there who detail out step by step or bullet points, just very direct type messaging advice on how to heal, how to grow, and things like that. And then you have the channels who are completely focused on specific teachers or philosophies or religions and things like this, right? To me, and this is just my perspective, but to me, looking at a variety of stories specifically is a unique approach. And that's why it appeals to me. I assume if you're a returning viewer and you're coming back for more, it appeals to you for some reason as well. And here's my take on that. My take is there's something to be said about stories touching us in a way, reaching us, impacting us in a way that direct communication cannot. And this is where we start to get into the type of topics that Carl Jung spoke about, wrote about, and everything with regards to archetypal imagery and symbolism, right? So if you think about your dreams as an example, you can have people from all over the world in different languages having the same specific symbols or characters or places or events popping up in their dreams. And when they are evaluated, there seems to be some legitimate parallels between whatever this person's got going on in their life, their challenges, their whatever's going on in their subconscious, right? Because a lot of people believe that dreams are essentially a way for your subconscious mind to try and communicate something to your conscious mind, the conscious part of your psyche. It's an avenue to try and become more conscious, right? So I definitely think that there's value in evaluating dreams. And so stories and fairy tales and folklore and everything that falls into this category, myths, they're very much in line with dreams. It's just that they are experienced consciously. And the cool thing about it is you can have multiple people reading the same story, or even in a movie, watching a story play out in a movie, excuse me, and you're experiencing it together. And so it's just similar to dreams, but yet different. And the other piece is this. There's some evidence, and you're welcome to do some digging and research and get on this rabbit hole if you want, but there's evidence that suggests that when a person's emotions are awakened, you might say, they become more attentive or more invested in the story. And therefore, whatever plot is played out in this story, the messaging within it or the lessons within it, they're going to stick because the person is emotionally invested or attached. It's sort of like, this is just my take, how shamans have worked throughout history, right? Which is why they have put on a show, essentially, with their very dramatic costumes and their dancing. And a lot of times it's shocking, and that's meant to tap into a different part of our psyche, to kind of be so shocking or just out of your everyday norm, what's expected, to be outside of the box, to be to reach another part of your psyche that your everyday life doesn't reach. Does that make sense? So stories are kind of like that too. But I think that the hook for us is empathy, the fact that we can feel for the characters. And so because of that, I'm reminded of in the Bible where it's talking about, that you have to have the eyes to see and the ears to hear. And essentially, the parables that Jesus taught, it was just well known, and he spoke about that it's not everybody is going to understand it, and not everybody is meant to understand it. And it's kind of like that with stories, because people who are incapable of essentially living from a space and place of love within, in other words, people who are incapable of loving other people, I don't personally feel like they're going to benefit from stories because they're so detached, from emotions in general. So it's kind of like, and this is getting more in line with the heart of the message, actually. It's kind of like when you're thinking about this hierarchy of needs, which I mentioned recently, it's like before we can really get further on down the road of growth and awareness and spiritual progress and all this, it's sort of like love is part of that foundation. It's needed. It's like in the Bible where it says, we love because he first loved us. And it's not so much, I've always read that verse or taken it as we are able to love others and ourselves because, we feel loved from the Father. But I think that it's more than that. I think that it's just a more expanded kind of love. In other words, if we feel loved truly, then we not only love ourselves and others as ourselves, but life in general. In other words, we have a grateful heart. And so this is going to kind of play into my takeaways from this story. And again, I just really hope you enjoy it. So, much ado about nothing. Ado is from the late 14th century, meaning conflict, fighting, difficulty, and trouble. Much ado means much to do, right? So essentially we could say this means much to do about nothing. The weakened meaning in the online etymology dictionary of ado meant fuss, right? To make a fuss from the early 15th century. And then Oxford defines ado as a state of agitation, especially about something unimportant. And this last definition, I feel like is the closest to what the story is all about. The characters are just making a big fuss about things, right? And we'll take a look at that. So we have some characters. We have two young ladies, Hero, one of them's name is Hero, the other one is Beatrice, right? From Beate, meaning happily, or she who makes happy or happiness or a bringer of joy. Now what's ironic is Beatrice's character, the character of Beatrice in the story rather, is not a happy person. She kind of is, but she's happy because she's always joking and at the expense of others too. So it's kind of like she's described as having, what's this quote in the book? She was of a lively temper and loved to divert her cousin, Hero, who was of a more serious disposition, with her sprightly sallies. So she's defined as having sprightly sallies. And then a sally in this sense is a rushing forth of wit. She's really witty, right? So, kind of interesting. So we're going to go ahead and read a little excerpt here, and we'll just read a little bit, talk about it, read a little bit, and talk about it. So, okay, here we go. I hope you enjoy it. So, it says, there lived in the palace at Messina 2 ladies whose names were Hero and Beatrice. Hero was the daughter and Beatrice the niece of Leonato, the governor of Messina. Beatrice was of a lively temper and loved to divert her cousin Hero, who was of a more serious disposition, with her sprightly sallies. Whatever was going forward was sure to make matter of mirth for the light-hearted Beatrice. At the time the history of these ladies commences, some young men of high rank in the army, as they were passing through Messina on their return from a war that was just ended, in which they had distinguished themselves by their great bravery, came to visit Leonato. Among these were Don Pedro, the Prince of Aragon, and his friend Claudio, who was a lord of Florence, and with them came the wild and witty Benedict, and he was a lord of Padua. These strangers had been at Messina before, and the hospitable governor introduced them to his daughter and his niece as their old friends and acquaintance. Benedict, the moment he entered the room, began a lively conversation with Leonato and the prince. Beatrice, who liked not to be left out of any discourse, interrupted Benedict with saying, I wonder that you will still be talking, Signor Benedict. Nobody marks you. Benedict was just another rattlebrain as Beatrice. Yet he was not pleased at this free salutation. He thought it did not become a well-bred lady to be so flippant with her tongue. And he remembered when he was last at Messina that Beatrice used to select him to make her merry jests upon. And as there is no one who so little likes to be made a jest of as those who are apt to take the same liberty themselves, excuse me, yes, so true, right? So it was with Benedict and Beatrice. These 2 sharp wits never met in former times, but a perfect war of raillery was kept up between them, and they always imparted mutually displeased with each other. So I thought that was pretty funny, and just a great description of these 2. So you have Beatrice and Benedict. They're essentially at war with their wits, right? And then we're going to see that Claudio is kind of quiet. He's kind of pulled back from the scene, and he is focused on Hero. And he's described as attentively observing her, okay? So, and it says he's silent before the noble guests, or she's silent before the noble guests, rather. So both Hero and Claudio are just kind of reserved, but Claudio is just focused in on her, okay? So he approaches her father, Leonato, and says, hey, I think that Beatrice and Benedict, they ought to kind of consider dating. I mean, they're a lot alike. And so Leonato actually comes back at Claudio and says, yeah, but I'm watching you look at my daughter. So maybe there's some interest there, right? Okay, so Claudio is good with this. He's like, this is great. I would love to propose to Hero, and Leonato's already, given me his blessing, so this sounds great. Okay, so let's go ahead and read a little bit more. So it says, Claudio was to wait but a few days before he was to be married to his fair lady. Yet he complained of the interval being tedious, as indeed most young men are impatient when they are waiting for the accomplishment of any event that they have set their hearts upon. The prince, therefore, to make the time seem short to him, proposed as a kind of merry pastime that they should invent some artful scheme to make Benedict and Beatrice fall in love with each other. Claudio entered with great satisfaction into the whim of the prince, and Leonato promised them his assistance, and even Hero said she would do any modest office to help her cousin to a good husband. The device the prince invented was that the gentleman should make Benedict believe that Beatrice was in love with him, and that Hero should make Beatrice believe that Benedict was in love with her. The prince, Leonato, and Claudio began their operations first, and watching an opportunity when Benedict was quietly seated reading in an arbor, the prince and his assistants took their station among the trees behind the arbor, so that Benedict could not choose but hear all they said. And after some careless talk, the prince said, "Come hither, Leonardo. What was it you told me the other day, that your niece Beatrice was in love with Signor Benedict?" "I did never think that lady would have loved any man." "No, nor I neither, my lord," answered Leonardo. "It is most wonderful that she should so dote on Benedict." I love how they speak. So it says, whom she in all outward behavior seemed ever to dislike, right? And so essentially all that they just go on and on about this, and Benedict's sitting there listening to all this stuff, right? And he's like, could it be? I've never, considered this. And so he starts thinking about her, Beatrice, in a new light, and he's starting to think that he's reframing essentially their interactions. And he's starting to see that maybe, what was behind this debateful spirit, of wits on her end was that she, felt something for him, right? So from here, my notes are awful. I made my notes last night, y'all. So, okay, so at this point, he's sitting there, he's thinking about everything. He's at the arbor, and then at this point, it says, here comes Beatrice. By this day, she is a fair lady. I do spy some marks of love in her. Okay, so she's approaching him, okay? And it says she has her usual tartness. So she says, "Against my will, I am sent to bid you come in to dinner." Benedict, who never felt himself disposed to speak so politely to her before, replied, "Fair Beatrice, I thank you for your pains." And when Beatrice, after 2 or 3 more rude speeches, left him, Benedict thought he observed a concealed meaning of kindness under the uncivil words she uttered. And I'm reading this and I'm thinking, this is so like many of us when we are dealing with someone who's genuinely, doesn't have a good heart or good thoughts or feelings toward us, and we're like, I know they don't really mean that, So that was relatable in that manner for me. But anyway, so this is what happens, and then from here, now it's Hero's turn, right, to play her part. It says with Beatrice. So they send for these other 2 ladies who do the same thing with her, right, with Beatrice. And so she overhears them as well. Okay, so this is the setup. And so it says, "It must have been a pleasant sight to see these old enemies converted into new and loving friends, and to behold their first meeting after being cheated into mutual liking by the merry artifice of the good-humored prince. But a sad reverse in the fortunes of Hero must now be thought of," right? And then it says, "The morrow," because it was literally the day before Hero and Claudio were to be married. "The morrow, which was to have been her wedding day, brought sorrow on the heart of Hero and her good father Leonardo." So this is where we have a twisting or a turning of the story, right? It says, "The prince had a half-brother who came from the wars along with him to Messina. This brother, his name was Don John, was a melancholy, discontented man, whose spirits seemed to labor in the contriving of villainies. He hated the prince, his brother, and he hated Claudio because he was the prince's friend, and determined to prevent Claudio's marriage with Hero only for the malicious pleasure of making Claudio and the prince unhappy, for he knew the prince had set his heart upon this marriage, almost as much as Claudio himself. And to effect this wicked purpose, he employed one Baracchio, a man as bad as himself, whom he had encouraged with the offer of a great reward. This Baracchio paid his court to Margaret, Hero's attendant, and Don John, knowing this, prevailed upon him to make Margaret promise to talk with him from her lady's chamber window that night, after Hero was asleep, and also to dress herself in Hero's clothes, the better to deceive Claudio into the belief that it was Hero, for that was the end he meant to compass by this wicked plot. So we have Margaret, dressing in Hero's clothes, and she's putting on the show and pretending to be Hero, right? So it says, Don John then went to the prince and Claudio and told them that Hero was an imprudent lady and that she talked with men from her chamber window at midnight. Now this was the evening before the wedding, and he offered to take them that night where they should themselves hear Hero discoursing with a man from her window. And they consented to go along with him. And Claudio said, if I see anything tonight why I should not marry her, tomorrow in the congregation where I intended to wed her, there I will shame her. The prince also said, and as I assisted you to obtain her, I will join with you to disgrace her. Okay, so it says, when Don John brought them near Hero's chamber that night, they saw Baracchio standing under the window, and they saw Margaret looking out of Hero's window, and heard her talking with Baracchio, and Margaret being dressed in the same clothes they had seen Hero wear. The prince and Claudio believed it was the Lady Hero herself. It says, nothing could equal the anger of Claudio when he had made, as he thought, this discovery. All his love for the innocent Hero was at once converted into hatred, and he resolved to expose her in the church, as he had said he would the next day. And the prince agreed to do this, thinking no punishment could be too severe for the naughty lady who talked with a man from her window the very night before she was going to be married to the noble Claudio, right? So this is the show. This is the spectacle, the big display of what we know to be deception, right? And so from here, it pretty much goes right into the next day, and they go, to the chapel, and sure enough, it's just brought out in front of everybody, in front of the entire congregation. And it says, Hero was heartstruck. And so she fainted, essentially, right? And it says, to all appearance, dead. And then it says, the prince and Claudio left the church without staying to see if Hero would recover, or at all regarding the distress into which they had thrown Leonato, right? So hard-hearted had their anger made them. It says, Benedict remained and assisted Beatrice to recover Hero from her swoon, saying, how does the lady? Dead, I think, replied Beatrice in great agony, for she loved her cousin, and knowing her virtuous principles, she believed nothing of what she had heard spoken against her. Not so the poor old father. He believed the story of his child's shame, and it was piteous to hear him lamenting over her as she lay like one dead before him, wishing she might never more open her eyes. And then we have another very subtle and just another character that's not in this scene for very long whatsoever, but a very important character nonetheless, right? So it says, but the ancient friar was a wise man and full of observation on human nature, and he had attentively marked the lady's countenance when she heard herself accused, and noted a thousand blushing shames to start into her face. And then he saw an angel-like whiteness bear away those blushes. And in her eye he saw a fire that did belie, B-E-L-I-E, the error that the prince did speak against her maiden truth. And he said to the sorrowing father, call me a fool. Trust not my reading nor my observation. Trust not my age, my reverence, nor my calling, if the sweet lady lie not guiltless here under some biting error. So he's essentially very discerning, right? So we have this character of the friar as the helper, as opposed to, in a lot of folklore and fairy tales, it's spirits or an angel or a fairy or an elf or some type of character like that. Here we have a friar, but still important because this is someone who is typically spiritual, right, of a spiritual nature or a part of a spiritual brotherhood. So the helper, who's kind of in the shadows, right, but makes a huge impact. So it says, when Hero had recovered from the swoon into which she had fallen, the friar said to her, Lady, what man is he you are accused of? And Hero replied, They know that do accuse me. I know of none. Then turning to Leonardo, she said, Oh, my father, if you can prove that any man has ever conversed with me at hours unmeet, or that I yesternight changed words with any creature, refuse me, hate me, torture me to death. And then it says, There is, said the friar, some strange misunderstanding in the prince and Claudio. And then he counseled Leonardo. Okay? So he's discerning, and then he's questioning Hero, and now he's counseling as well. He's an advisor, which is typically what a helper character does in these stories. They give counsel, they advise. Okay? So he starts to counsel Leonardo that he should report that Hero was dead. And he said that the death-like swoon in which they had left Hero would make this easy of belief. And he also advised him that he should put on mourning and erect a monument for her, and do all rites that appertain to a burial. What shall become of this? Said Leonardo. What will this do? The friar replied, This report of her death shall change slander into pity. That is some good, but that is not all the good I hope for. When Claudio shall hear she died upon hearing his words, the idea of her life shall sweetly creep into his imagination. Then shall he mourn, if ever love had interest in his heart. So we're seeing a testing. This is a testing of Claudio's love for Hero. His love is being tested, right? So again, then shall he mourn, if ever love had interest in his heart, and wish that he had not so accused her. Yea, though he thought his accusation true. Okay, so meanwhile, you have Beatrice and Benedict, right? And she's just furious, at Claudio, because she knows this is total fabrication. So she is trying her best to get Benedict to kill Claudio. And he's like, no, I'm not going to do that. That's my best friend. I'm not going to do that. So he agrees finally after, it goes on and on for a while with her trying to persuade him into punishing or even to death his friend Claudio. And he won't do it. So he finally agrees to a duel with Claudio and to challenge him to a duel, a fight, right? And so it says, and now came Benedict, and he also challenged Claudio to answer with his sword, the injury he had done to Hero. And Claudio and the prince said to each other, Beatrice has set him on to do this. So they know she's behind it right away. Claudio, nevertheless, must have accepted this challenge of Benedict, had not the justice of heaven at the moment brought to pass a better proof of the innocence of Hero than the uncertain fortune of a duel. Yeah. While the prince and Claudio were yet talking of the challenge of Benedict, a magistrate brought Borachio as a prisoner before the prince. Borachio had been overheard talking with one of his companions of the mischief that he had been employed by Don John to do, right? So this guy was caught. So Borachio made a full confession to the prince in Claudio's hearing that it was Margaret, dressed in her lady's clothes, that he had talked with from the window, whom they had mistaken for the Lady Hero herself, and no doubt continued on the minds of Claudio and the prince of the innocence of Hero. If a suspicion had remained, it must have been removed by the flight of Don John, who, finding his villainies were detected, fled from Messina to avoid the just anger of his brother. So that's like confirmation for everybody, right? The heart of Claudio was sorely grieved when he found he had falsely accused Hero, who he thought died upon hearing his cruel words. So he truly thinks she's dead, okay? And the memory of his beloved Hero's image came over him, in the rare semblance that he loved at first. And the prince asking him if what he heard did not run like iron through his soul, he answered that he felt as if he had taken poison while Borachio was speaking. And the repentant Claudio implored forgiveness of the old man Leonardo for the injury he had done his child, and promised that whatever penance Leonardo would lay upon him for his fault in believing the false accusation against his betrothed wife, for her dear sake he would endure it. The penance Leonardo enjoined him was to marry the next morning a cousin of Hero's, who he said was now his heir, and in person very like Hero. Claudio, regarding the solemn promise he made to Leonardo, said he would marry this unknown lady, right? But it says his heart was very sorrowful. And he passed that night. When I first read this, I thought it meant like he passed away, but it doesn't mean that. He just passed the time. So he passed that night in tears and in remorseful grief at the tomb which Leonardo had erected for Hero. So when the wedding comes around, the bride is in a mask. She's masked. And when she removes her mask pretty quick in the ceremony, it's actually Hero herself, right? So it's a happy ending. It's a joyful ending like most all of these stories, right? And then we have Benedict and Beatrice, who, everybody's sharing in the joy in the moment, right? And they're wanting to get married as well. But they actually find out at the wedding that everybody had schemed to get them together. Okay, so we're going to read about that. So it says, they found they had both been tricked into a belief of love, which had never existed, and had become lovers in truth by the power of a false jest. Pretty interesting. But the affection, which a merry invention had cheated them into, was grown too powerful to be shaken by a serious explanation, since Benedict proposed to Mary. He was resolved to think nothing to the purpose that the world could say against it, and he merrily kept up the jest and swore to Beatrice that he took her but for pity, and because he heard she was dying of love for him. And Beatrice protested that she yielded, but upon great persuasion, and partly to save his life, for she heard he was in a consumption. So these two mad wits were reconciled and made a match of it. After Claudio and Hero were married, and to complete the history, Don John, the contriver of the villainy, was taken in his flight and brought back to Messina. And a brave punishment it was to this gloomy, discontented man to see the joy and feastings which, by the disappointment of his plots, took place at the palace in Messina. And that's true. That's true in life. People who wish you bad. It's strange. I can't even wrap my mind around it, honestly. But that your happiness and joy can be perceived by someone who has such a lack of love in their heart. Instead, they literally have hatred in their heart. Your joy can be perceived by some people as punishment, personal punishment. And so this is how far, on the other end of the spectrum of balanced and healthy a person can get. And we know this. But let's just look into some of this a little bit here. So let's see. Yeah, last night, y'all, I literally couldn't keep my eyes open. And I was like, I always try to film the same day I make my notes because it's fresh on my mind. But I would have looked, I don't know, drunk or something. I actually don't drink, but that's not true. I might have a drink, once a year or two or three, but it's very, very rare. So, but all right. So what was interesting is, Don Pedro, who was the Prince of Aragon, who was Claudio's friend, his brother's name was Don John, right? Now, Pedro actually means rock or stone. It's from the Hebrew Peter, okay? And then we have Claudio, whose name means lame or uninspiring and dull. And it can also mean broken. And it's from various root words, too, that suggest that it means broken, right? And his character was indeed broken when he heard, the news, thinking that his soon-to-be wife had passed away, right? And so, yeah. Oh, his name, Claudio, also means like crippled, weak, lame, all this. So there's like this essence in Claudio of a brokenness or a weakness, right? Or a handicap. So if you consider his name standing for these things, and he himself gets broken, right, or weakened and devastated, and then we see how his character in the end is restored. Think of it this way. It's kind of like brokenness itself, or weakness itself, or handicap, an insufficiency, an immaturity, anything like that. That itself gets broken and devastated before it's not only restored, but reconciled with this other element for full completion and maturation to wholeness. And we're going to talk about this other element next, okay? Because in these stories, a lot of times what we see is they are indeed personifications of archetypal symbolism that applies to each one of us, our own psyche, right? And so we're going to take a look at it through that lens. So there's something to be said both about the couple. I'm looking at the symbolism especially through the lens of couples. So you have Hero and Claudio. And Hero was described as just kind of the opposite of Beatrice. She was not lively. She was not even happy. She was just more serious and reserved. So very much like Claudio too, okay? All right. But this weakness, this deficiency, this brokenness, this handicap, all of this in Claudio's character gets broken and devastated or torn apart or shattered or however you want to see it, and then restored, but there's another element brought in. Okay. So remember that, this plan that was devised, it was essentially coming from Leonardo because he was the one in charge to make the decision, but he was counseled, right, by the friar, okay? But what's interesting is Leonardo's name is related to a lion, right, or a king, the king. So the plan devised by Leonardo, ultimately, was to test Claudio's love for Hero. So there's this testing of love, okay? And so, yeah, I'm just recalling the hero's journey here in my notes. And then we had this other scheme, deployed by Don John, right? And this was to be enacted and was enacted or deployed or put forth, rather, by Borachio, right, or Borachio. So there's a Spanish word, borracho, or borracho, which means drunk and intoxicated, right? Also from Latin, burrus, B-U-R-R-U-S, it can mean red and flushed. But when I was thinking about Borachio's name, meaning drunk and intoxicated, and I was reading about it too, it also means saturated or drenched, right? Like if a person has, drank too much. So if you think about this character, Borachio, or Don John even, both of them, because they were just alike, described as being just alike, they were drenched and saturated in what? It's not described as they were lacking. They were described as discontented, which is kind of like a spirit of lack. They don't have contentment, so they're discontented. But they are also saturated too. So it's not only an absence of love, but an overfullness, being overly full with hatred and deceit, right? And I would say jealousy too, right? So just interesting here. Now Margaret, remember, she, if I'm not mistaken, I didn't write it down, I think she initially helped Hero to convince Beatrice that Benedict, loved her. But then she was easily swayed to the other side, and she worked with Borachio too, right? Now her name is Pearl. And so pearl as a verb from the 1600s means to make into a form or to cause to assume the form and appearance of a pearl. That's what she did. She she shifted into this other person. She faked everybody off into thinking she was Hero. So her name's very appropriate. She's a shapeshifter, right? So, and then what's really interesting is she did assume the form of someone, Hero, who was a true lady of virtue, like a true diamond or gem or pearl, you know what I mean? So, so we have this, in the beginning, I was talking about this combination, archetypal symbolism represented in the couple of Hero and Claudio. And then we have this combination, Don John was behind it, but the people who actually enacted the bad scheme were Baraccio and Margaret, okay? So, yeah, I feel like they represent the villain essentially together, or you might even say, Satan character in the story too, because she was pretending to be virtuous, right? When in reality, it was just all wicked. So now looking at Don John, okay, because he was the one behind all this. Now looking at John, it's kind of funny because we know that John can mean a toilet, and it can also mean someone who solicits or a customer of a prostitute, right? And yet, it's also from Johannes, I don't know how to say this, or Yohanan, meaning Jehovah has favored, or Yah, or Jah is gracious, right? So it's related to, one who has received God's grace, So there's like this duality, right? Oppositional, polar opposite duality, Jekyll and Hyde, represented in his name, which is interesting. And I feel like maybe you might, if you wanted to dive even deeper, look at him as the trickster character, even though I don't really see any good. Well, we do see good that came from it in the end, because this was all a part of the testing of Claudio's love. So see, this is where you have those trickster characters who can be very malicious, very much so, and wicked. And yet there's good that comes from it. I don't know that they really should get the credit for that, though. You know what I mean? And so that's where we look at his name and we see that it's all, negative stuff, talking about a toilet and, a customer, a prostitute and all this stuff. But yet it also means recipient of God's grace. So this is kind of where we bring in Romans 8:28, where God can use these people too, for ultimate good in the end. So, the schemes in the story were for the purposes of, number one, awakening to love, and deepening love, I would say, right? And also testing love. Yes, and that did require that that brother, the malicious brother. It required a villain, a trickster archetype. So, yes. So the friar, who was just mentioned briefly, a very brief appearance, in Old French, is from frere, meaning brother. So here we have a malicious brother, and then we have a good brother, right? So we have one who's good and one who's bad. And so, and what's interesting here is, Don John was a schemer for the bad side. But the friar also deceived Claudio, see. So you can almost couple these two brothers together and say that they are together representing that archetype of the trickster. That's kind of how I see it, right? Because he, the friar discerned Hero's innocence and he counseled Leonardo, right? So he was, again, we have another character who's a mediator between the hero represented by Hero in this story. Her name's actually Hero. And her father, which is who? The king, right? The lion. So you have this mediator role. Okay. So we might see, the friar through the Christian lens as being the Holy Spirit. Discerning and just working things out in the shadows and for good, amongst different people, but also counseling you as well. Okay. So let me take a look at this here. Yeah. So I was thinking about pairing those two together, the friar and Don John together as the trickster archetype. I said, if we consider the trickster archetype as an internal duo, it kind of makes sense because one frees from slander. Remember, the friar was trying to help Hero to be free from this false slander that has been thrust upon her, right? But the other accuses falsely, right? Which was Don John. Now, who is described as being the accuser? Well, in the Bible, it's Satan, right? And in fact, in Revelation chapter 12, verse 10, he's described specifically as the accuser of our brothers. So very interesting. And he was specifically, Don John in the story, working against his own brother and his friends. So there's a strong element of brotherhood in this story. Even the Prince of Aragon and Claudio and Benedict, they're all coming back from war. They're brothers, in fighting and war together. So think about this. I'm seeing the hero's journey in this story. I can't help it. It's just there. So if the hero's journey is about maturity, which a lot of times we look at it through that lens, right? Does this mean that maturity is equivalent to, and I have some ideas, moving from trying to impose one's will onto others to observing the truth within others? Okay, so you have Don John imposing his own will onto others, right? But the friar is observing the truth that's already within others. So there's a very different energy here, see? And I feel like if a person is early in the hero's journey within their own life and more on the immature side of the spectrum of personal growth in the spiritual realm, they can tend to just be very self-focused and just think about this. Children, they have to have things their way. It's got to be Burger King everywhere. A home with mom and dad and everywhere they go, it's everything has to be their way. They just naturally just want to impose their will and their desires everywhere onto everybody and everything, right? But at some point, as we mature, we learn to let go of that, and we understand that, it's not reasonable, and we don't even want to do that anyway. And so we have the mature friar, who is just observing, Hero very closely and discerning her down to such detail that he's looking into her eyes and watching the flushing of her skin and how it turns to whiteness. And so he's observing the truth that already resides within her instead of trying to force something to happen or play out a certain way. So that's one way that maturity can take place, right, is represented in the story. Another thing that was interesting, or another way to look at this, as far as just a journey of maturing, right, is going from melancholy and discontented, right, to incorporating a little spirit, right, just having a little bit of humor and lightheartedness, in other words, taking things really seriously to just being lighthearted and jovial. That can be a journey of maturity. And what's interesting is I think a lot of times it's viewed the other way around. I think that sometimes people who are jokesters, are viewed as very immature. And I think they can be. I think it depends. There's a lot of other elements that come into play here. But just in looking at the story, we have the characters of Hero and Claudio, right? As being very serious and lame, or weak, and we also have Don John described as melancholy and discontented and all this. But in the end of the story, and this is where I was talking about incorporating this other element, right, into the wholeness of oneself. This other element is represented archetypally in the couple of Beatrice and Benedict. They're brought into the wedding ceremony as well. And this other element is that of lightening up, loosening up, having fun, being lighthearted, being jovial. And they're described as just joking around with one another. So it's just a lightheartedness, that is needed, for full maturity. I also view this as in the Bible where it's talking about, returning, we must become as little children again to enter into the kingdom. It's kind of like, we can be very rigid. We can find ourselves not by our choice, but just because life is hard. It's just hard anyway. And we do go through testing and trials and all kind of stuff, and that can make us very rigid. And we can start to take things very seriously, but humor is so healthy. It's so good for us. It's so healthy. And so I loved how this story specifically highlighted that, and how that's like this final element that's needed to seal the deal. You know what I mean? And so I thought that was really beautiful. Let me check my notes, make sure I haven't missed anything. I've got like 5 more pages, y'all. What else did I write? I think that was it. Yeah. So Beatrice is described as sprightly, which means full of spirit or vigor, right? She's lively. Now, the meaning of Benedict is from Benedict, meaning a newly married man, right? So this is like a rebirth. And a marriage to this spirit of life and vigor, right? So Benedict is from the late Latin benedictus, meaning blessed. So there's a happiness, there's a feeling of being blessed, which includes keeping up the jest, as they call in the story, joking, a lightheartedness, right? Humor. So, so I love that it moves from kind of black and white thinking through the characters of Beatrice and Benedict, right? So if you're thinking about debating, that's sort of like a back and forth, right? I'm thinking like a ball game. It's just kind of back and forth, sort of like a black and white type thinking. But in the end, their relationship grows to be expanded enough to contain both love and good-humored ridicule, And think about it. It's kind of like, it's not very welcome for someone that you don't know very well and that you don't really have a close and good relationship with. It's not welcome for those kind of people to ridicule jokingly, like in the manner that Beatrice and Benedict did. Like it's not okay. But if it's somebody that loves you and that you love them and love has been established, see, like in the story, love was tested. I know it was a different couple in the story, Hero and Claudio, but still, if you look at all these people as personifications, then they're representing that, right? So love was tested first, okay? And then because love is there, now it's okay to kind of joke, with and at one another, right? So Yeah, it's like the marriage couldn't take place until love was tested and proven through the characters of Hero and Claudio. Um, yeah, you have to be at a good place with someone where you don't doubt the love that you share before you can relax and joke and feel lighthearted and happy, right? Um, so let me propose this to you too. So what if we zoom out and we apply this concept, right? Um, to the testing, or rather the proving of God's love for us. Okay, just follow me through all of our trials and tribulations. Because I think that sometimes when we go through trials and tribulations, we think that we're the ones being tested. And I'm not saying that's not true. But instead of viewing these challenges in our life as a test that we have to pass, what if these are opportunities not for us to prove ourselves so much, but for God to prove his love for us? Maybe our part is just to be receptive enough to discern that. You see what I'm saying? That was my big takeaway right there. And again, last night, I don't know, it was like 12:30, 1 o'clock in the morning, and I'm writing, and my eyes won't hardly stay open. And I'm like, I really wanted to film tonight, but I couldn't. So, yeah, what if instead of viewing these as tests for us, we view them as opportunities for God to prove his love for us, okay? It's kind of like this. There's like this old saying, right? Like, what would you do if you knew you wouldn't fail? I'm sure you've heard that before. Well, it's kind of like that, but instead it would be like, what would you do if you knew that God loved you? Or if love had already been established, right? I know that, when you're in love, even with a person, it's, your heart is full, it's full. And it's kind of like, there's so many songs written about this, y'all. I'm trying to think of an example in the moment. I can't think of any except Billie Holiday's Blue Moon, where she's talking about, she's lacking this love of her own, and so the moon is blue, but then it turns to gold, because she finds a love of her own. And that's kind of how it is. It's like love is a lens, see? Love is a lens, and when our heart is full of love, of being loved, and therefore seeing everything in our life through the lens of love, everything's more joyful. Even things you do in solitude is way more joyful. It's kind of like trying to, if you have a hobby, trying to paint. It's one of my favorite hobbies. You may not really want to or care to or be inspired to, but if your heart is so full of love, it's like it encourages you. You want to express. It's like an overflow, right? And it's got to go somewhere. So then you're just more inspired to create yourself. So there's like this, just this energy, this stream, this river, this flow of love. And so I'm reminded in the Bible where it says we love, like I said earlier, because he first loved us. And so I don't think, again, that it's just about loving others. It's that too, but it's also loving yourself and loving everything more. The things that, your hobbies, your, whatever you do, the flowers in your yard, the plants, the trees, everything. The moon is different to you now because you have love in your heart. So, yeah, it's, what would you do if you knew God loved you, So just something to think about. Could you be a little less serious like Hero? Could you relax a little and find the humor in it all like Benedict and Beatrice, right? What if the proof of love and the ability to discern the proof of love, right, for you is the key, Can we look at our trials and tribulations in a new light and have the eyes to see his love, right? Would you flourish if you were loved? Would you feel complete and happy and content if love was proven to you, right? Um, and this is why, again, they make all these songs. I put Love Makes the World Go Round and All You Need Is Love. I mean, there's so many songs. But again, just maybe consider the trials not so much as tests for you. They may be that too, but just consider that they are also opportunities for God's love to be proven to you as well, right? And so, yeah. And yeah, love and appreciate others too. Yeah, so I've already shared that. So I hope that this has been encouraging and inspiring. I hope you enjoyed the story. I love to hear the way he writes. And I don't know how much of that has been modified, actually. In this particular version by Charles and Mary Lamb from 1915, they may have changed the language a little bit from Shakespeare's original language, but it's just been fun for me to read. I hope that you've enjoyed the story too. And then the next one after that is, I believe, As You Like It. As You Like It. And all I can think of is the movie, I can't think of it now, Princess Buttercup and Wesley. What is that movie? That's a good movie. I can't think of it right now. The Princess Bride. Yeah, he's always responding to her, as you wish, as you wish. But this is the next story. I have no idea if it's going to be similar or not, but it's called As You Like It, and I have not read it yet, so I'm assuming I'll be sharing that next. But in the next video that's about a Shakespeare story. I'll have other videos coming out too, just about other stuff. So again, thank you so much for coming along to hear the message. I hope that you have a beautiful day, and I will see you again very soon.